Hi everybody, I'm Mary ROWE from the Canadian Urban Institute, and I'm really pleased to be able to participate today in World City and for us to bring you some of the perspective that we're experiencing here in Toronto. Toronto is in the center of Canada. It is on the traditional territory of a number of First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples, and as you've been hearing, I'm sure, through the sessions that you've been watching over the last few days, that part of our ongoing discussion here is how do we as settlers reconcile ourselves to the truth of the way in which urbanism has been exclusionary of Indigenous peoples and also has reinforced structural racism and all sorts of barriers that have made our cities not optimally function for everyone. So part of what we do at CUI is create platforms for connective tissue where we can exchange best our experiences, what we're learning and what we're struggling with. And during COVID, there have been all sorts of struggles around how cities need to be more equitable and the extent to which the way in which we've planned and designed and the way in which we live in cities has in fact reinforced structural racism and all sorts of challenges. So I appreciate that World City is tackling this head on and that we have an opportunity to learn from one another about how we can do better, how we can build, to use the phrase that seems to be in common parlance now, build back better, but probably build differently. So I just want to acknowledge that we are appreciative of the opportunity to be here, and we're actually physically in Toronto on a stage of a wonderful theatre facility that traditionally would have lots and lots of people around, but in fact it's just me and these two fabulous participants who are going to talk. We're going to talk about culture, and they're going to share with you some of their experience of what they think the impact of COVID has been on culture, but how do we see culture playing a role as we emerge, and what is that going to look like? And we appreciate that there are people certainly in Canada and around the world that are still experiencing the acute impacts of a global pandemic. We never want to be insensitive to that. There are other places that are at different stages and recovering perhaps more quickly or just in different kinds of ways. And so I always establish at the outset that we know that we have listeners who will be at different stages and still may well be in the throes of crisis, and so we want to be respectful of that. So joining me today are these two gals. I was going to call you gals, and then I realized maybe it's a little familiar. I shouldn't know you that well to call you a gal. But DEVYANI and Ashley, both of whom are in the culture business, or in the culture, they have a vocation as culture workers. And I'm going to ask you guys to tell us better how you're defining your own role and what you would see as some of the, what are your impressions that you're coping with right now in terms of how it feels in the community that you're working in and the sector and all the colleagues that you talk to and interact with in the cultural community and in the sector that you work in. So let's just set the ground if we can for a minute. And I'm going to start with you, DEVYANI, to just give us a picture of where the ground that you stand on and what your perspective is for culture going forward and what you've experienced over the last, what is unbelievably 18 months. Over to you.
Wow, thank you, Mary. That's it's a big question. I'm DEVYANI SALTZMAN. My pronouns are she, her, and happy to be speaking from Takaranto Treaty 13 territory. I've straddled for many years, for 15 years, institutional space, and I'm now an independent writer and curator for the first time in almost 20 years. After being head of public programming for the AGO, which is Toronto's art gallery and the fourth largest museum in North America, and before that, a founding curator at Illuminato, which is our multidisciplinary festival here. I've left organizational space about 6 months ago to write about BIPOC leadership in the arts and what systems change can actually look like. And to me, the pandemic, in a painful way, has given, I think, a little bit of a gift to many arts workers to reevaluate what are our values? What should our institutions be doing to serve publics? How do we be better for ourselves in terms of structural inequity? So I've spent the last 18 months in a consulting independent space thinking about how do we rebuild our organizations, and some of them may not survive, and that's okay. So I'm just thinking about what does Institution 2.0 look like if we should be in institutional space at all. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I want to come back to you and talk to you about Institution 2.0. I'm a person who actually, through the pandemic, has been running ostensibly an institution. The Canadian Urban Institute's been around for 30 years. But we have many institutions, particularly in Canada, that are much older than that. So I'm interested to hear more about that and what is, I hadn't heard someone say Institution 2.0, but I appreciate the heads up that that's obviously part of the change we should be observing and what that would look like. Ashley, talk to us about you. Where are you in this in this sort of constellation of culture workers? Where do you fit?
Yeah, it's a great question because I kind of bend a little bit. Also acknowledging my pronouns are she, her, and acknowledging that we are on the space of Treaty 13. But for me, I have had a very I guess it's a blend of my practice that's had to come forth. I have my own small agency. It's called We're Dope, and Dope Agency, and part of it is about creating space for BIPOC creators and artists, and that was established actually during COVID because of I guess the terms and the situations that we were facing with a lot of projects getting canceled. But also I'm in the space of working as an independent curator, very similar to Devyani on an independent level. Because of what's happened with COVID, we've had to propel our careers in different directions, I would assume. But for me, it's a lot of the focus of my practice has been how are we creating space and how are we utilizing public space now to be the new way of how we look at delivering art forms. And what does art form look like? We're going into an age of AR and tech. We're going into a lot of placemaking, and I think that we're being challenged to look at how we use non-traditional spaces. And my background has traditionally been in using DIY spaces, using non-traditional spaces. A lot of it is outside of the gallery system. It's outside of institutions unless I've partnered. In the past, I've started on a grassroots level with festivals and kind of made my way up to working with the city and working with, I guess you would say, brands and on a commercial level. And I think that a lot of that has come from understanding how we place make and how do we utilize space in different ways and non-traditional ways. So I guess to answer the question, I mean, some of the challenges I'm dealing with are still very real challenges of COVID-19 and the aftermath, or we're, the tail end of a pandemic, but the unsurety of if we're actually on a tail end, if we're going to continue to be kind of living in restrictions. Are we able to open up doors to institutions, or do we have to keep finding ways to fund our artists and get funding from revitalization programs from the government and keep things digital and consider how we want to, make a plan B for our projects and our programming. Like it is a very real challenge because, every month it changes. And then we also have to consider how we're utilizing space when we're talking about Indigenous artists and how we're placemaking with BIPOC artists and what stories we're telling. And when we go back into the heritage of Toronto history museums and working, I'm on the committee for the Awakenings program here with the City of Toronto, and a lot of that is rediscovering our heritage here in Toronto and what that means from the Black and Indigenous storytelling lens. So there's so many discussions happening, obviously, from a community standpoint and how we're using space, but also what stories we're telling. Most of my work for the last year and a half has been centered around that topic.
I know we could fill our whole time defining culture. What is culture? Is it art? Is it, and rather than doing that, though, I just want to offer one anecdote that I think that having had 18 months where we couldn't actually gather in a group of any kind, to me seems to be the worst affront to our experience of culture. That we've had to be alone and cope with it alone or within our bubble, or deal with it on a digital medium. And I'm wondering what both of you think about as we re-enter. Are people going to be able to re-engage? Will they feel safe enough? Because it's not just the pandemic, but as Ashley just suggested, we've had a much more heightened awareness of exclusion and people not feeling validated and not feeling safe. How do you imagine, we were talking about a theatre production that's returned here in Toronto, and I've got to say I had some apprehension about whether I was ready to actually go back into a shared space. So what do you gals think about the role of culture in your observation? Do you think that we can put ourselves back into a kind of shared space and that will feel creative and safe again?
My first point to that question is there is no culture without people. So I think that it's not even like a sense of responsibility, but as we start to get normal again, like, or whatever that vision of normalcy is going to be. And we've always adapted culture, like we shifted it online, we went digital, we went virtual, and there was a sense of connectivity online. But when we talk about in real culture and what culture means, like from an institution or public art or theater, or, you know, I was just at the ballet at Harborfront outside for the first time with the National Ballet. I've never experienced ballet that way. I think that we also are going to have to challenge what we think or like what that nostalgia of culture was for us.
Well, yeah, maybe, and some of that's good, right? Like all of a sudden, we have done a lot more outside, and we have been compelled to say, well, hell no, we're not going to do nothing.
Right.
We're going to find a way to somehow be in relationship with one another. Do you think that'll stick? Do you think will we ever go back to just the old way of doing it? Or what do you think?
I'd like to think, and this word's been used a lot, but I'd like to think we're moving into a new reality that is a hybrid reality, and that we're going to relate to cultural production in new ways. Like Ashley said, seeing the ballet live outside. When we went, when the museum closed down, for example, we went digital in all our content, but we also realized we could be a space for performing arts venues that had closed during lockdown. So the Toronto Symphony Orchestra or Rise Edutainment used the AGO as a public space, and there was huge hunger for live experience. And you alluded to this play, which is by the amazing Cliff Cardinal, in a Cree performer, writer, theater maker. It was 50% capacity, and it's selling out quickly. So I think the demand is there, but I also think there's an excitement about what new forms can look like that are hybrid in terms of experience.
Well, and some of you worked at Luminato, right? Like you were one of the curators there, and I remember that was I was living in New York when I first came back. I spoke at Luminato 100 years ago, and you were in an old abandoned space, and it was quite remarkable. Nobody had thought of it that way. Now suddenly the pandemic forces us. You were talking about this, Ashley, that we're going to use derelict space, empty space, alleyways, parking garages. I don't know. Do you think has it sort of catalyzed? I don't want to idealize what we've just been through, but has it catalyzed and forced us to bring the ballet out to Harborfront?
Absolutely it has. And I mean, what we're going to do when the weather shifts is a completely different story. But I actually think that
we're going to shiver.
We're going to shiver and go back to digital maybe, but and I mean, there's beautiful winter programming that happens here.
Right.
We live in the very cold, nation of Canada. So I guess for me, I still believe that some of the most brilliant projects have been pushed out of us having to pivot into this space. Like for instance, a project that I just completed this last summer, I mean it's still up in fall, was Nina Chanel Abney's first appearance here, who's a pretty prolific artist, is from New York-based artist. Her first appearance here was a 120-foot ground mural that went, it completely spread across Toronto. And if this was 2 years prior, I think the grab would have been to get her pieces. Her pieces are selling for just under $1 million on like the auction houses. She was just finished doing the New Yorker magazine. So the idea of having her on a ground mural, which to me is how I always envisioned her work should be in a public space, would have been much more far removed from people's minds had we not had to be forced in releasing a project for the Year of Public Art here for Toronto during summer when we were just reopening with a lot of restrictions against us. Do I feel that it was better, there was better access to it, that it was better received, that people were more excited to go see the work? Oh, absolutely, rather than had it just been placed in an institution or, the high-end gallery. So I think that there's so much problem solving that has come out from us adapting to having to utilize new spaces and think about how we're consuming.
One of the things that we talk about in urbanism, city building, is the importance of porousness, or what some fancy people call porosity. I'm not sure it's a real word, but I've heard people say it. This idea that a neighborhood to be really vibrant and healthy needs to not have firm boundaries. It needs to bleed, so there's lots of movement and in and out and this kind of exchange. And when you talk about your practice, Ashley, what I hear is, can we encourage culture can we create the enabling conditions for culture to sprout up in all sorts of places and not be confined only to a certain kind of space, an institutional space, for instance. And when those spaces were closed and we could not occupy them in traditional ways, it sounds to me, and I think I can see it with my own eyes, that we have found a new new platforms. And in essence, the technology is doing that too. In AR, you were talking about your practice now in incorporating AR. And do you think that maybe when we come out of this, there's going to be kind of like a sudden kind of burst of new creativity? Could it be a perverse positive thing, a perverse activity generating all sorts of positive stuff? Do you see that in your practice? Do you imagine it? You'd quit an institutional job in the middle of a pandemic. You must have had some sense of, I got to bust out of this.
I think there's exciting new spaces that we are just beginning to realize. And I don't know, as somebody who was always putting, kind of was raised within the institutional framework, that felt like a measure of success for many years. But I actually am seeing so many people and practitioners like actually working outside of those spaces or in lateral collaboration, that the way we're working now, and I hope after the pandemic or in whatever endemic reality we live in, is not so much among a hierarchy of power that says art has to be presented in certain spaces that have hallowed histories, or change making has to happen only within those walls, but actually it is a porous reality, whether it's Ashley's project out in public space, or an exhibition within a major gallery, the National Gallery of Canada, for example, or an independent artist doing their own work via podcast. I just like to think of it as hopefully flattening, and I don't know if that's true or not. I'd love Ashley's thoughts on that, but that's what I'm observing happening as people start to make in different ways.
And when you say flattening, you mean more accessible to all sorts of...
More accessible, but also not in a hierarchy of power around kind of creation only happening within spaces with large $60 million budgets.
That's interesting. I was going to ask you about money. I was waiting for us to talk about money. Like, what should the money flow differently? I wonder about how we've allowed art to become commodified. It's got to be ticketed. It's got to be... do you think maybe... Is this a new renaissance? Like, are we going to be able to affirm different ways in which people engage, not necessarily always for remuneration? What do you think, Ash?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many questions. I mean, the idea of funding is that so much funding now, at least here in Canada in our government system, on a provincial level and a federal level and a city level, has shifted to new media and media creation from a digital lens. And the idea that AR and all of these practices are becoming ways that we present communication and art on the forefront. But also, I think that the idea for me of expansion or new ideas, creative bursts of ideas coming from this is a plus. It's great. But I also think that these work alongside the institutions and alongside practices the way that we were already receiving art, because it really is something it's a measure that's meant to help sustain art through moving through or pivoting through different, shifts and phases. So to think that we obviously won't do away with these practices. AR is advanced. Technology is advanced. It's innovation. I think public art and using public spaces the way that we're seeing now is advanced. And I think that it should be used as a support system for the galleries and the institutions. It shouldn't be separated, because that's how we're expanding our reach right now. We're expanding it globally.
Yeah. Well, and again, that porousness that those institutions, remember there's that initiative that was started at George Brown College that Luigi Ferrara came up with, the Institute Without Boundaries, the idea that the institution bleeds out. And of course, the concept of creative placemaking was really coined here in Toronto by Tim Jones, at the time the executive director of Artscape, right?
Yep.
Who basically said, wait a second, we can reimagine shared spaces in different kinds of ways.
Yep.
Do you think we're kind of at the 2.0 of that suddenly it's not just intentional space that's been curated? Can it happen sort of serendipitously? I feel like that's had to happen during COVID, that artists and creative people have found a way to express themselves because they can't not. But it might have been on a sidewalk or in a back alley or some other kind of meanwhile space, eh? What do you think about that transformation?
I mean, I think the spontaneity of how people have been creative in the pandemic, especially in the first, second, third wave lockdowns, whether it was porch concerts or readings, was amazing and adaptable. But I also feel like there is a hunger for what we're sitting in now as well. So I don't know if that
it's going to be both ends, right?
Exactly. I think it's going to be both ends. And the question is, especially in this province in Ontario, with capacities and with Delta, what do more formal performing arts spaces, how do they adapt and sustain through the rest of the pandemic?
Well, one of the things, and we talked about it a bit as we were walking in, from the green room. There's absolutely, for the audience around the world, we're in a beautiful several hundred, 1,200 seat theater, I would assume, in a convention center that normally has tens of thousands of people in and out of it. And there's nobody here except us and the crew. And that is true across the Central Business District here in Toronto and through central business districts across this country, that we have space that's empty. Do you think, I mean, obviously that will change, but not everybody's going to come back to their offices. Are we going to see a kind of transformation of how we use spaces? Could we, for instance, imagine sharing commercial space that might have used to have office workers? Could artists and creatives come into those spaces?
That's exactly, I think, what's happening right now. So one of the latest projects I'm working on is curating 35,000 square footage in the new CIBC towers. Our latest and greatest like architecture from a bank, right?
Yeah.
So I think the idea of sharing space and creating space for artists and diverse artists as well on top of that is a real discussion that's been happening. It's probably been happening for the last few years, but we're being forced into actually having to program that way based on the idea that our canvases or our spaces to show are being minimized.
Mm-hmm. Well, but that would be interesting to sort of economize differently. Say, well, we've got all these assets that exist. We've got schools, we've got faith institutions, we've got office buildings. Could they be repurposed? Could they be made more flexible? I know of a mechanism called a meanwhile lease, which is something that you could temporarily use. And can we get people to just be more comfortable that the city is like it's a vessel?
There's also the idea too, and then back to DEVYANI, there's also the idea too, it's how we're also understanding how we bring in acquisition and how we, what are the appropriate spaces to be bringing in permanent collections. The banks have been doing it forever, but I think also as we're expanding our minds about how we bring in what would be seen as really valuable monumental museum pieces or gallery pieces. Our idea of acquisition is also changing, which is also a part of placemaking as well.
And the acquisitions don't have to be confined to one kind of space.
Or a well-funded gallery or institution.
I mean, one of the great things about cities is you turn a corner and there's something you didn't expect, right? And isn't that part of the commitment that we experience when people are programming for public art? I think part of what they're trying to do is enhance the aha experience. And, oh, that I didn't expect that. Do you think that we're going to see more permission, more of an understanding that zoning should change and that we could suddenly put art where we didn't expect it? What do you think? In a parking lot, in a derelict lot or something? I don't know.
I'm not in the inside of, I mean, obviously we're just starting in the year of public art and Artwork Studio just launched, and I'd actually be curious to hear from both of you what you have seen and enjoyed. I went to an amazing exhibition by Raji Aujla up at Bayview Village, which centers Punjabi Sikh artists looking at kind of matrilineal lineage. And
it's in a commercial space?
It's in an abandoned LCBO. In Bayview Village in the
perfect.
mall.
That's what we're going to do with all those LCBOs.
How great is that?
It was great. It was so great.
So it's in a mall.
It's in
a commercial space.
In a commercial space in an abandoned LCBO.
Yeah.
And that's
the
really
liquor
great.
control board for people. That's the way we sell booze in Ontario.
A very good use of the LCBO space. Exactly, a former LCBO.
So again,
space.
for us to start thinking really flexibly and imaginatively, as we cohabit an urban space, how can we allow more different kinds of experience?
Yeah. I mean, also to go back to what DEVYANI was saying, these ideas, in 2019, I think that was our last New Week launch here in Toronto. We were no stranger to these things, except they existed in fairs or New Week launch was a 12-hour stint that you'd have, and I curated the mall and the parking lot and all of that. But it was looked at as something that was really, I think. I mean, it was trendy, right? That was a trendy thing to do. Wow, look at how you.
But it was sort of a one-off. It was kind of like
and
it's
had
what
12
cool
hours.
kids did, right?
Yeah, and it was you're a great you're a cool
Can we
curator.
normalize it? Can we make it just part of everyday life? I look at my street. I live on a main street, and I look at all those patios that have been thrown into the parking lanes, and I just think that looks like fabulous cultural exchange to me. And it's had to happen, and it's right in front of me. And I can stumble on it.
Well, what we're experiencing now, at least in my lens, is a shift of, I think we're shifting culture. So I think it's it's yourself, DEVYANI referring to wow, that was really cool. We saw that in LCBO, or you're seeing this in your patios. So I think it's just becoming, again, back to the conversation of what we're normalizing, is that we're shifting culture for the wider audience that maybe isn't used to different ways of experiencing art. And we're kind of softly forcing them into new ways of consuming art. It's cool, it's trendy, but now it's becoming the only time that we can do it. Now your public art has to be done in these spaces, and eventually it's just going to be something that's a regular practice for, I think, like placemakers or programmers or culture makers to actually start thinking this way. It's going to be part of a mandate. It's going to be like your public art, that mandate, we've written it into the mandate that we have to do public art. It has to be street level art. So that is becoming part of the funding system, the granting system, and the ways that we're actually getting opportunities to do this work.
I guess that's maybe a question we should sort of finish up on, which is, what do you see the role being of government and public policy to try to enable these kinds of things? You're talking about a program unique here in Toronto with some investment behind it and some a set of goals and some parameters, and now, as you say, it's going to socialize it, where suddenly it's not a one-off. It suddenly becomes part of the deal. Do you see any other kinds of policy things that you'd be advocating for?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges, and I feel like I was just appointed to the board of the Toronto Arts Council, and we talk a lot on the programming side about the welcome, whether it's the welcome to audiences, but also to creators, especially BIPOC creators, to feel they have a space to apply for these funds. So there's an increase in applications, but the pot isn't actually big enough to sustain the growing number of emerging artists who are starting to apply for these funds. So one, I think we need to be funding the councils more, but also I think the bigger conversation in this country is about universal basic income and basic income for artists. So we can program and have engagement and civic engagement, but if we actually can't have sustainable livelihoods for our artists and our emerging artists, we won't be able to move forward.
And this is a sector that was hit extraordinarily hard because there wasn't income support through an employer often. So many artists are freelancers. But we did have, for a period of time, direct income support. So we, in essence, had a universal basic income through this period of time. And, the world didn't collapse under the weight of providing that support. So do you think maybe that's the next step, is that we're going to be able to create those kinds of conditions where people can be creative and have a livelihood that allows them to be so?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I actually just really second that. Like, there's the idea that we have grants for or funding for projects that are like maybe already in production, and we do have a lot of development grants here, but actually thinking and talking about the livelihood of our artists and what that income is. Musicians, like the granting system is not as friendly to musicians, for instance. So depending on your genre, I think there has to be more thought that goes behind that. Some of these genres, just like these disciplines, depended solely on live events. Yeah. Openings or concert halls, or et cetera, performers, dancers, performers, those are the ones that I, even more so than the visual artists or the multimedia artists, that I feel like took the biggest hit. And like, we still are in waves of considerations of how to support them, because that income is very hard to sustain without having that in real life opportunity.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess the one thing, as we just wrap up here, I guess the one thing we can be, I think, cognizant of is that I think people realize what they missed, what they didn't have, even they didn't necessarily take advantage of it always, they didn't have access to it. And so as we come through this, I hope that our listeners who are listening who have had a chance to hear these conversations, understand that they themselves, it's incumbent on you to be working with your policymakers and your artists in your community, those that are in cultural production, to think about how do we emerge from this and create a new kind of ecosystem that's better resourced. How do we use the existing assets that we've got and really not lose the momentum that I feel like you're describing to me we've seen?
I think, Mary, another point that we haven't brought up, and part of that is also whether it's in a large organization or a small, we have to look at who are the power makers and the people holding the purses and our spaces. And we know post June 2020, there's been a huge push in kind of more formal institutions around DEI and having lived experience from governance down. I don't think we can lose sight of the importance of BIPOC folks in positions of power and culture to really ensure that, I spent 20 years, you can program for diverse audiences and appear super progressive in content, but it doesn't mean what's behind the scenes reflects that in terms of organizational structure. So in tandem with what we're doing with funding or who we're showcasing, we have to ensure that institutions and organizations really reflect the people they serve from the inside out. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out as a point.
Absolutely.
Last word to you, Ashley. Last word to you.
My last word was that's a great point. I co-sign that, and if I were to add any little point to that, like being us, travel being restricted and us having to kind of be in this isolated bubble, I also saw a lot of programs that were bringing it back to Canadian history and Toronto history, and like redefining and rediscovering our culture here. And I think that's a huge impact on our society here in Toronto, is to also think about the funding and the opportunities and how we're storytelling and giving people a chance to dive a little bit deeper to our culture and history, our heritage here, including our Indigenous people. That is the basis of where to start.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you, for joining us at World City. You're sitting in front of a Toronto sign that has Indigenous and different kinds of traditional insignia behind it to remind us of what our traditions and history are here, and how we can reconcile ourselves with what you've just raised around reconciliation. So thanks very much for joining us, and I'm looking forward to what the audience will make of this and their interaction about the culture that they're experiencing and the future of their city and the role of culture. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.